I
Hmm.
want to go into the use of proskuneo or
Yes.
proskino in the New
Mm.
World Translation, and this is one that's all throughout the Bible. I just grabbed a couple examples, but I didn't take the number down. I think there's somewhere between 80 and 100 examples. I think,
Yeah.
and then after that, I want to take a look at what I've deemed the most egregious example of a translation issue in the New World Translation. But we'll take a look at that after the worship stuff. So let me explain this. I'll pull up an example here in Acts 7. Where are you? There you go. Acts 7:43. And this is just a random example. I made sure that this was an example. I guess technically it's not a random example, but it's an example I chose where the word proskuneo, that's a Greek word which typically is translated as worship, and it's used in this passage to refer to somebody other than Jesus. And it's very important to recognize that in this passage, the term worship is used for someone other than Jesus. So 743 in Acts, it reads this. Um, but it was the tent of Moloch and the star of the god Rephan that you took up the images that you made to worship them. So I will deport you beyond Babylon. So this is an Old Testament quote. And basically, what's happening here is they're being referenced as worshiping false gods. Now, what's important to recognize is that this word worship is using the term proskuneo. Now, if we pull up another example, John 9:3 and 9:3-8 is a really good one here. So if I go to John chapter 9 and verse 38, Jesus is interacting with an individual. So the man was born blind. So Jesus is talking to the blind man and says, Jesus said to him, you have seen him. And in fact, he is the one speaking with you, referring to himself as the Son of Man, right? Again, Son of Man is one of those things. You go back into the Old Testament prophecies, and Son of Man is clearly a reference to deity. But with that being aside, we won't take that one. Continuing on, it says that he's the one speaking with you. And he said, I do put faith in him, Lord. Now, this is the New World Translation. Remember that's why it's a little awkward here. But then it says, and he, that's the blind man who was made to see, he did obeisance to him. So now, what's the difference between worship and obeisance, Daryl?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me just make an observation about proskuneo as a word generally in the New
Hmm.
Testament to start with, because I think this is often overlooked. And I think if you don't read Greek, of course, it would be. Why would you pick this up? But again, if you just look at the word proskuneo, everybody agrees that it can have the idea of worship, or it can have the idea of bowing down. When we look at this word in the New Testament, we tend to find that, so every verb, well, not every verb, but transitive objects like this, transitive verbs like this, when a verb has a direction that it's heading in, pointing to a particular item or person or whatever, typically the object of that verb is going to be in the accusative case. What you find with proskuneo is the overwhelming majority of the uses are actually in the dative case. And that's what you see here. And you might say,
Hmm.
well, why is that significant? So the idea of the accusative case is it limits the scope of the verb, whereas the use of the dative case is much more, in fact, some have called it the case of personal interest.
Hmm.
Now, if you think about it that way, and this is so when my doctoral work was on, a lot of it really focused on the use of the word heart in the New Testament and how we understand the functions of the heart from a biblical perspective. My position on this is actually that proskuneo, when it takes the dative case, it has in view the heart, an action of the heart. And when it has in view, when it takes the object in the accusative case, it generally, and again, not always, but generally has the physical idea in mind. So when you look at the word proskuneo, ask the question, well, what's the object of the verb? What case is it in? And so what you see here in chapter 9, verse 38, and also in that other one we saw in Acts just before as well, is that the object here is in the dative case, which suggests
Hmm.
that it's the case of personal interest, which tells you that this is actually an action that is going on not merely physically. Yeah, it could be physical, but the emphasis by the use of the dative case is that personal interest. It's that direction of the heart, if you like. So when you ask the question, what's the difference between obeisance and worship. The difference is that the word obeisance really, if anything, and I think this is just semantics over English words, right?
Yeah.
If anything, I think what they're trying to say is he bowed down to him, right? But the word obeisance kind of means that, but it also kind of has that heart kind of intention to it as well. So really, this is more like obfuscation. It's trying to just make it confusing for the
Right.
reader. But again, the Greek using the dative case makes it really clear. Another really good example of this, for what it's worth, is when we go to the temptation of Christ. You have in the temptation of Christ there, you have, Satan says, I will give all these things I will give you if you bow down and you
Mhm.
worship me, right? And so there, the dative is being used again. And Jesus actually replies, and he says, the Lord your God only you will serve, or you will worship. Now, when Jesus says you will only worship the Lord your God, he uses it in the accusative. So
Mm.
Satan says, I want you to worship me using the dative, that heart focus. Jesus says, no, I'm only going to bow down. I'm only going to bow down before God. But then he uses another word, lutrusis. This word lutrusis actually has a very similar usage. It's actually the word used for serving in the tabernacle and in the
Mhm.
temple in the Old Testament. And so this actually is now used with Jesus with the dative case. It's another one of those verbs that actually takes its object in the dative or in the accusative. And so by combining these two ideas together, Jesus's answer is much more comprehensive to say, I will only bow down to God and I will only serve God. I'm not
Mhm.
going. And so that actually tells us that when Satan's asking Jesus to, worship him, he's not just asking for him to bow down, but actually for
Right.
him to serve him as well. And Jesus is really explicit in saying, no, I'm not going to do that.
Right. Now there's a couple of really interesting examples that kind of how now I didn't think to check the case of the following word of the object in here, but you'll be able to school me here a little bit. So if we go to Revelation, you probably know exactly where I'm
Yeah.
going. So
Hmm.
Revelation 22:8 near the end gives us a picture of John being totally overwhelmed by everything that he just saw. Right, he saw this grand vision, became the book of Revelation, and toward the end of it, after he sees the new city and he sees the rivers of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb, he bows down before the feet of the angel which showed him. So in verse Revelation
Hmm.
22, verse 8, it says, "Well, I, John, was the one hearing and seeing these things. When I heard and saw them, I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who had been showing me these things." And of course, the angel says, but he tells me, "Be careful, do not do that. I am only a fellow slave." Now, this is the New World Translation that I'm reading from, actually. Be careful, do not do that. I am only a fellow slave of you and your brothers, the prophets. So the angel is clearly saying, what you're doing is totally unacceptable for you to be doing to me. Stop doing that. Right. So there
Mm.
seems to be an essence of the angel recognizing that this is not something to be given to angels, but to be given to God only. So what's your review of the Greek there?
Yeah, so if you look at verse 8 in the Greek, probably we're not doing this right now, but if we look at verse 8 in the Greek, so one of
Yeah.
the things about words like proskuneo too is it is actually one of these words that doesn't always need to take an object, and that's called an ambitransitive verb.
Hmm.
Um, and so when it takes the object, it's going to be in the accusative or in the dative, but it can also exclude the object, not take something
Hmm.
as an object. And that's what we see here. It's actually an infinitive. It doesn't have an object, so it's just to worship. Doesn't tell you what he's worshiping. It
Right.
does tell you where he's worshiping, the direction that he's facing when he's worshiping before the angel, is what it says in the Greek there. And the angel takes that as to say, well, no, 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 no. I am neither the person and this is not the place for you to do what you're about to do, to bow down and to worship. So it's not clear whether this should be understood as physically bowing down alone, or
Hmm.
whether this should be considered with a whole heart. But I think the whole point of the context is to say, here's a response, right, that comes from the heart of John as he sees these things, which I would say argues for that personal interest idea. But
Hmm.
the text itself isn't clear because that's not what it's trying to do. So it doesn't really specify an object of worship in this case, but it just gives you that overarching idea of worshiping generally.
Right. Very good. All right. So that's the inconsistency of the translation of the word proskunew. Now we didn't go too much into detail, but it's interesting how in the New World Translation, every single reference to the word proskunew, to worship, when it's applied to Jesus, is always translated either to bow or to do obeisance. And then every instance where it's not attributed to Jesus, it's translated to worship. So again, running into that inconsistent use of certain words.
Yeah,
I mean, I
just
guess
trying
they
to put a point.
I guess they consistently what is it? What's the term? They consistently misapplied it.
They're consistently inconsistent.
That's right.